very good afternoon to all of you lovely ladies and the gentlemen. On behalf of Art Forum San Francisco, co-sponsored by the South Asian departments of UC Santa Cruz, Berkeley, and Stanford University, we welcome all of you to Sala 2023. The topic for this session is Shelf-Aware, with our guest speakers V.R. Ferose and Vikram Chandra. Just a few house rules that you're already aware of. Before we begin our session, please put your phones on silent and no flash photography or recording. And with that, let's give our panelists a big round of applause as we begin the session.
So are you doing a bio? No. Oh, good God. Okay.
Don't waste time on bio.
Yeah, no, okay. So just to give you a short introduction to Ferose, okay? So the first time I met Ferose was I was invited, I just released a book. Oh, sorry. I just released a book called Geek Sublime, which is a kind of strange book. It's about programming languages and pre-modern Indian aesthetic theory. And I got an email for somebody who worked for SAP in Bangalore, right? So I think techie crowd will know who SAP is, right? So I said, yeah, sure, I'd love to come. And often when you're invited to like kind of corporate events, they want you to do like motivational stuff, right? But there, I was like very aware that the questions that were being asked for me were really literary kind of questions. So then I was told, okay, now we'll meet Ferose, who was like high up, head man, head cheese at SAP. So I walk into his office, and like there's like a huge shelf of books and books and books. And I was like, who is this weird guy? So since then, we've become friends, right? So one thing about him, that he's still at SAP doing incredible work. Another thing about him is that, I'll tell you more about this. He writes a column for Indian Express and has been doing it about books, but that's a very inadequate description of the columns that he writes. And then also, he's really interested in integrating people who are on the autistic spectrum into everybody's lives, right? Into companies, into cultural life. And that's another aspect of him. So he's a very multi-faceted guy. And this is the second thing I've spilled today. And he's also, so I won't tell you more about him. Go find him at his website, Ferose, Ferose, VR.com, okay? And I also want to tell you, if I might wax sentimental for just half a minute, he's one of the warmest, I gotta choke up, one of the most generous people I've ever met. And I'm proud to call him my friend. Okay, I'll stop.
Thank you.
So, Ferose.
Thank you. Thank you, Vikram. It's good to have friends like Vikram. But I just want to kind of start by saying I was there at that incredible session by Dr. Verghese. But before that, me and Vikram were having a chat with Dr. Verghese at the Speaker's Lounge. And this is the first time I'm meeting Dr. Verghese, even though I've heard about him for years now. And then he comes and says, Ferose, I'm looking forward to your session. And I was like very excited that actually Dr. Verghese decides to attend my session. He's busy signing the books right now. But then he said, I'm really looking forward to you having this discussion with Vikram, where you will be asking questions to Vikram. And so I said, sir, sorry to disappoint you. It's the other way around. So I just want to, how many of you came to hear, if you've come to hear Vikram, sorry to disappoint you. Sorry to disappoint you, but this is going to be a conversation between two friends. We've known each other for many years. And let me also try to give an introduction of Vikram, because Vikram is one of the most incredible writers that all of us know, but he's also an outstanding technologist. His last book was Geek Sublime. That's why I invited him to speak at SAP. It was about coding and how coding is a form of art. So he's a writer who's also a very good technologist. I'm a mediocre technologist and even more mediocre writer. So it gives me great pleasure to actually share the stage with my very dear friend Vikram. So let's hear it for Vikram Chandra, please.
Okay, so as you can see, Ferose is a bookman. right? And we'll go deeper into this in a minute. So maybe we'll show the movie later?
Yeah,
Or you
we'll
want
show
to?
the movie a little later, but let's kind of warm up
Okay.
for the next. We are here for
Yeah.
the next 45 minutes. I just
Yeah,
want
yeah.
to make sure that you guys
Yeah, yeah.
have fun.
Okay.
All I have, in the technology world, we have a term called death by the PowerPoint. I won't kill you with PowerPoint. We're just going to tell stories. Is that okay? I'll tell you stories about my journey with books. No PowerPoint, but I want you to give me 2 minutes to show you a short video because it is very, very important mission. I'll do it at an appropriate time. Is that okay? But otherwise, I'm just going to tell you stories with books. Is that a good deal? Yeah. Fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so Ferose, I know that you've had a deep, deep connection with books since you were a young man. So could you tell us about how that started and also do a little advance reveal? He's a crazy book collector, right? And he's going to tell you about these books, which are amazing. So how did you, first of all, get into books, book collecting? So give us a little.
Okay, I'm sure most of you are book lovers. How many of you are serious book collectors in this room? Fantastic. This is a lovely audience. Thank you. How many of you kind of have a lot of books at home? Okay, even better. So everybody loves books. So let me tell you my story about how I got into books. So I come from a very modest middle-class family. I'm 49 years old, so you can imagine when I was growing up, my father was in the Indian Railways, and for every middle-class family, education was the only way to succeed. So my father told me, either you become an engineer or a doctor, or you won't become anything in life. And the only way to become an engineer or a doctor was to really study hard. I was incredibly fortunate that I grew up in a place called Kharagpur. How many of you know Kharagpur? Kharagpur is famous for two things. The Indian Railways is one of the longest railway stations. And the second is the Indian Institute of Technology. I could see the IIT Kharagpur tower from behind my house. So it was kind of inbuilt into me that you have to go to IIT, otherwise you are a loser basically. So long story short, my brother, who was 5 years older to me, actually cracked JEE and went to IIT. I was incredibly mediocre. I worked very hard, tried to crack IIT twice, didn't get through, finally landed up in NIT Computer Science, which is not a bad option, but I didn't get into NIT. What it did was, if you are growing up in Bengal, two things happen. The girls are forced to study or do Rabindra Sangeet, and the men have to either play soccer or read tons of books. Okay, and I did both books and soccer. So I read a lot of books, but we didn't have enough means to buy books. So the only option was my dad used to subscribe to something called Reader's Digest. You remember? Everybody remembers Reader's Digest. I don't know what happened. I mean, it's such a lovely, such good, positive story. So I grew up reading Reader's Digest from the time I remember. My father subscribed to Reader's Digest from the year 1964, still continues to subscribe for that. So I read a lot of Reader's Digest. Then I went to college and stopped reading, okay? Because the only books that I had access to were the textbooks, and I hated them. So I was computer science. I sold my textbooks to basically buy a good meal. That's what I did at the end of every semester. But I was incredibly fortunate that my then girlfriend and my wife was a voracious reader. And one of my ideas was to write about my class, my group of friends. And she said, you know what, you should read this book called The Class. How many of you read Eric Segal's Class, right? Eric Segal's more famous book is Love Story, but she said, you read Eric Segal's Class. This is about a class coming back after 25 years. Maybe you can write about your friends who after 25 years may become famous. So that's the book that got me back to reading. Now, obviously you had limited means. Then I started working in Chennai. And the best thing about Chennai was the pirated books that you got very close to the railway station. Anybody from Chennai knows that? Wow, see, everybody is able to relate. So Chennai railway station, you walk out, you get the pirated books. And they were very cheap. So I started my rereading with pirated books. The good thing about pirated books was it was the unofficial bestseller list. The books that was on the pavement were the bestsellers. And I'll conclude with this short story because it's fascinating that one of my favorite books, which I read but didn't understand, was a book by Gary Zukov called The Dancing Woolly Masters. Outstanding book on quantum physics. I read and reread because at that time it was fashionable to read that. You can kind of show that you are reading Dancing Woolly Masters and they'll think you're very smart. So a lot of people bought Dancing Woolly Masters, didn't understand. But what was an interesting turn of events was I was giving a speech somewhere in Menlo Park, and then the person who was sitting next to me was Gary Zukav. And as turn of events, he has become my mentor. He has become one of my very dear friends, and we both discuss quantum physics quite often. He come and has stayed at my home. So books has played an incredibly important role in my life, and Dancing Woolly Masters kind of connecting back 25 years later and making me meet someone like Gary Zukav was an incredible moment. So I just wanted to kind of give you a broad thing about my journey with books and reading.
Okay, so Feroze is light-footing it a bit when he says he's a book collector. So Feroze, what I want you to do first is, I don't know how many people will know about this. Book collecting can become a mania, a completely irrational obsession. So if you tell us, give us 1 or 2 examples of this, and then tell us about these things over here.
Okay. So here is the problem with book collecting. It is the only disease for which there is no cure. And my wife has this big problem that every wardrobe in the home is full of books. And so last year she gave me a warning that if I see one more book delivered at home, I'm going to call the lawyer. And so to kind of play it safe, now I deliver my books to my office address. But book collecting is really maniacal. And people kind of choose a specific area of book collecting because it's so infinitely large, you can decide what you want to collect. And one of the first books that I got signed was from Dr. Shashi Tharoor when he had come to Bangalore, I think almost 20 years ago. Like I see a lot of people, signing books now. I stood in queue, took a signed book, and I said, you know what, maybe I'll start collecting signed books by authors. And remember, this was pre-Amazon days, pre-eBay days, so it wasn't easy to get signed books unless you actually went to a book signing session. So that's how I started collecting books. I have around 3,000 signed books, but I've moved from just getting signed books to getting rare signed books. And I thought I should show you what a real rare signed book is actually about. So I'll show you, there are many books that I have, but I'll show you two very, very rare books because I think you'll get a context of what a rare book is about, and more importantly, how you get them. Because what you don't want to do as a book collector is go to an auction house because it's obscenely expensive. Okay, but if you know dealers, then they will help you get a rare book. So I want to show you first book. I'll tell you a little bit about the book, and then I'll tell you how I got this. So when I was in Bangalore, there was an incredible bookstore called Blossoms. How many of you have been to Blossoms? Fantastic. So if you go to Blossoms, behind Mai Gowda, who's the owner, he has a signed letter from Rabindranath Tagore. And I saw this like 20 years ago. And I'm like, shit, man, how did he get this letter from Tagore? As luck would have it, I think it was 5 or 6 years ago, a dealer reached out to me, not a dealer, a bookseller reached out to me and said, there is this very rare book that's come up, which is called the Golden Book of Tagore. And it has the signed letter by Tagore, the original signed letter. And I'm like, wow, how did this happen? So I wanted to really know more about it. So the book, a little bit about the book, this book was written as a tribute to Tagore on his 70th birthday by Nobel laureates. So Einstein, people like Gandhi and many others actually came together and said, we need to write a book in tribute to Tagore. And that is this book, which is a tribute to Tagore, written by many Nobel laureates. Okay. Now, what is significant about this book is there were a few books that were given to very, very famous people, and this book was given to Homi Jahangir Baba. So it is from his personal private estate. And what you will see is the letter that Tagore has written for this in this book, and this is what you see here. So if you see, not only is a beautiful letter, it's an outstanding handwriting, and I feel handwriting is a lost art. Nobody writes anymore, right? But I'll read this letter just so that you understand what an outstanding poet Tagore was. If you allow me like 30 seconds, I will read this one paragraph that he's written so beautifully that only a poet can do. So he writes, "It is hard for me to say in a few faltering words how I feel when voices greet me from my own country and from across the seas, carrying to me the assurance that I have pleased many and have helped some, and thus offering me the best reward of my life." Rabindranath Tagore, December 27th, 1931. Now, people ask me, what's the price of this? I say it's priceless. So that's just an example of what a rare book is about. You don't necessarily get them in auction houses anymore because people don't want to part with it. My hope is at some point I will donate all of this to a museum. I'll tell you another rare book, which is also a fascinating story, but I'll tell you how the collector's world works. This is a very famous book by John F. Kennedy. All of you know he won the Pulitzer Prize for, anybody knows? Profiles in Courage. He got the Pulitzer Prize for Profiles in Courage. I wrote a column last week about ghostwriting. This is the only book where a person has been given an award for Pulitzer Prize for not writing the book. It was actually written by a speechwriter, right? So this was ghostwritten. Kennedy fans, don't hate me for saying this, but that's just the truth. Now, this is a copy which Kennedy had given to one of his colleagues that was passed from one generation to the other. And for some reason, the person who finally had this book had some financial distress. So he wanted to sell the book, but he didn't want to make it public because it would be very embarrassing that a gift that John F. Kennedy has given to his family member, he's now selling to make money. So he said, I want to give it to a serious collector where the book finds a good home. A lot of serious collectors don't want to sell the book to make money. They say, I want the book to find a good home. And so someone knew that I was into collecting signed books, so he gave it to me for a very nominal price. This on the market would be very, very expensive. But he said, Ferose, I just want two things from you. You should never talk about the book, but if you talk, don't tell you got it from. So I cannot tell you from where I got this, but what he did was he basically scratched the name of the person that Kennedy had signed it for. So he said, am I allowed to scratch it? Because it will reduce the value significantly, but I want to maintain the privacy because I don't want to know that I had to sell this. So serious collectors are not about money. Serious collectors are about finding a good home for the book. So I just thought I'll tell you two stories about rare books and how you can, I started by basically collecting, standing in queue and getting signed books. Now I have a huge collection of rare books.
So we were talking a couple of days before that, okay, so there's the book, the physical object, there's the signature on it. But it's always seemed to me when you talk about books, there's something mystical going on, right? When I see this guy holding a book, there's something else, right? So it's a very vague question, but what is that? What do you get from actual physical presence of a book?
So, I've been writing a bi-weekly column for the last 7 years, which means I have to produce 25 columns, and my original word length was 850 words. Then when the newspapers started shrinking, they made it 650 words. But they still wanted me to continue to write. Now, every time I write a column, you remember you have to produce something every 2 weeks because your space in the newspaper is fixed. There's the print and the digital. You basically have to tell a story. And the reason why this book is different from a million other copies of Profiles of Courage is because I can tell you a story. So every time I hold a book, I'm trying to tell a story so that the reader gets interested in it. And for me, Gandhi and Tagore have been the heroes of my life. And when I hold these books, I don't know what, but I feel their energy. There is something that has transpired that they held the book, and I'm holding that book too. And that energy is something that I just can't explain. It's just magical. So that's what it is, Vikram. I don't know if I answered your question, but there's something magical about some energy that flows through a book. And I'll tell you this because my last book was called The Invisible Majority, and there is a fascinating story about this invisible majority. And I'll tell you this because I think you guys should know this. The foreword is written by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Okay? So here is the story. I finished writing the book in September of 2 years ago, 2021. The book was supposed to be released on 3rd December, which is the World Disability Day, and it was supposed to be released by the Vice President of India. So I'd got an appointment with the Vice President. I was flying down to Delhi, and everything was done. The manuscript was complete. Only thing I was waiting for was a foreword. And I said, who should write the foreword for this? And for some good reasons, I had access to His Holiness's office. So I said, you know what? Let me give it a shot. I sent a mail with a manuscript, and I asked his assistant, his name is Setsen, T-S-E-T-S-E-N. I said, Dear Setsen, this is a book about people with disabilities. I'd be honored if His Holiness will bless the book, because I think through his blessings, the entire community of marginalized people with disabilities will be blessed. After 2 days, he said to me, how much time do you have? I said, I have 4 weeks, because I need 4 weeks for it to go to print, and then another 4 weeks for it to get distributed, and it has to be launched on 3rd December, and I'm in September. He said, our typical wait time is 9 months. Because he said, we get hundreds of requests, and every year they pick max 3 books. Out of the 100 books they get, hundreds of books, and His Holiness may then decide to maybe pick 1. But it takes us 9 months to even catch up reading the books. So send it to me, come back after 9 months. So I was like, oh shit, because I have the appointment with the Vice President, Mr. Venkaiah Naidu in Delhi. The publishers have basically prepared the marketing campaign, and I have 2 choices, either to postpone the launch, which my publisher would hate, or to just give it a pass and go with somebody else. And I said, you know what, maybe I'll take a chance. And I told the publisher, we'll wait for 9 months. He said, Ferose, are you stupid? The book is finished. After 9 months, the stories and the content may not be relevant. This is the most idiotic thing you are talking to me about. We have to go with the print. I said, I'm not going it, I'm going to wait. But he said, what's the chance? You know, maybe he gets 100 books, and what's the chance he'll pick your book? I said, you know what, we'll wait. My publisher was, I think, was so disappointed, he didn't speak to me for a few days. So I wrote to Sets and said, you know what, I will wait for 9 months. You finish reading it and come back to me. As luck would have it, after 2 weeks, he sends me a mail saying, Ferose, I've read the book and I absolutely love it. I'm like, okay, what happened? And after 2 days, I see the foreword written by His Holiness in my inbox. And I launched the book. On 3rd December, it became the #1 bestseller on Amazon for 6 weeks. Now this is not the interesting part. The interesting part is, after I was on a book tour, I thought, I need to check with Setsen, how did 9 months become 2 weeks? So I wrote to him very nicely, thank you for getting me the foreword, but can you explain to me what happened? How did that 9 months become 2 weeks? He said, you know, we were researching about you. The team was researching about me, and they said the first Google search result that when I hit VR Ferose that comes is a Forbes article which said how autistics triumphed at SAP. So I ran a program where we hired people on the autism spectrum, and that became a global movement. My son is on the autism spectrum. He said something incredible. He said, I just want to let you know, my daughter is in the autism spectrum, and she's also looking for a job. It's almost impossible to get one. You're doing so much for the community. I wanted to do my little bit by ensuring that the book is read in time and released in time. What's the chance? So that's how the foreword from His Holiness happened. And you know, the world is connected in magical ways. I just don't know how these things work, but you know, this is something that I take. And so the whole community was so happy that His Holiness actually wrote the foreword for this book. It's just one page, but believe me, more people bought the book to read the foreword than what I wrote for 300 pages.
So, so also, when you collect books, I don't know how you could collect digital books, right? So there's something about the analog, physical nature of books, of these books, that is necessary for what you do. And you're very involved in thinking about the future of, books that are in the physical form. So do you want to talk about that a bit more and maybe show you?
So I'll show you, I'll tell you why I think this is a huge problem, and I've spent a lot of time trying to find solutions for this. So, I work as an executive at SAP, so thanks to my day job, I get to travel around the world. I had a team in 40 different countries, and I was traveling around the world. One of the things that I did, I used to tell my assistant every time, whichever country or city I go to, make sure you give me half a day that I can spend for myself, not pack it up with meetings, which is typically the case, but give me half a day. And for that half a day, allow me to go to the closest independent bookstore. It didn't matter whether it was in Buenos Aires or Shanghai or everywhere in the world, I would go to the nearest bookstore, because a bookstore is where I really found the culture and the nuances of that community, right? Every bookstore had its own bestseller list, and so what are people thinking and reading about. And in all my travels in my last 15, 20 years, I found two contradictory things happening in the bookstore that I went. The first was everybody loved an independent bookstore across the world. It was with no exception. You talk to the people, they say, this is such a great place for community to come together. We love to come and browse here. That's the first thing. But the exact opposite was also true, that everywhere I went around the world, bookstores were shutting down. Around the world, with no exception. And so I said, why is this dichotomy, right? People love a bookstore, but they're all shutting down. And what was also interesting is that every time a bookstore shut down, the community came together to raise funds. They would do Kickstarter campaigns and a lot of things to save a bookstore. But if a Target or a Kohl shuts down, nobody cares. Have any of you gone to, let's save the Target? Nobody does that, right? But if a bookstore shuts down, everybody is starting a campaign to save it. So I'm like, wow, this is interesting. People love a bookstore, but there is no future. Absolutely no future. So I said, let me look at the business model of bookstores around the world, and haven't found a single business model for bookstores to exist. Maybe in the next 5 to 10 years from now, it would not exist. Okay, and I've spoken to booksellers across the world, I've spoken to thinkers across the world, and I haven't found a viable business model for bookstores to exist. And so 2 years ago, I met, me and Praveen Madan, who's the founder of Kepler's, CEO of Kepler's, me, him, and Dave Eggers, the famous writer, we got together and we said, what is it that we can do to spread awareness about why physical books and bookstores are important, because they're places for the community to meet. My niece and nephews, who are like 10 years old, they are all digital native people. They're like, are you stupid? Why do you have 3,000 books? You can have one, Kindle, right? So there's a whole generation that's growing up who just doesn't believe books are required in the physical form. So my big question that I was trying to answer was, is there a future for physical books, and more importantly, independent bookstores? So we started shooting for a documentary which will be released next year. If you allow me, can I show you like a 2-minute teaser of the video? And Dr. Verghese and many others will be part of it. But this is just a quick 2-minute video of the teaser. And if anybody wants to support this, this is a non-profit work along with Kepler's. Can I quickly show the video, please? And increase the volume.
If you just want a book, you can press a button. But that feeling of I'm in a place I want to be, it feels good, it smells good, I like the other people in here even though I don't know them, that's a big deal.
If you know what you want, you can find it very readily. But what if you don't know what you want? An interest that you don't even know you have.
When we walk into a bookstore and see who's there, that has brought them there in the first place, These are places where we can come to learn, not just come to buy.
The person who works there knows even more than you do and can kind of beckon you toward what you didn't realize was yet there.
Reimagining independent bookstores is a vehicle for bringing together all parts of the literary community, not just independent bookstores around the nation, but also authors, publishers, to say, what might the bookstore of tomorrow really look like?
This vision of an independent bookstore turning itself into a community bookstore where it thinks of its community first, and the community really becomes a mission and the identity, and the community gets involved in funding it, financing it, running it, owning it, is actually a very powerful idea.
A thriving independent bookstore is a part of the lifeblood of a community. Every village, every town, every city needs those spaces now more than ever.
A kind of modern agora, like the Greek place where people from different walks of life can encounter each other, recognize each other as being members of the same tribe.
And you simply can't recreate that in a corporate environment because there's too many rules.
I'm really terrified of thinking 1 or 2 generations ahead and wondering, will books still exist?
Looks like the print circulation is declining at about 6 or 7% a year.
Nobody's coming to save us. We have to take charge of our destiny ourselves.
I just got a signal. We have 10 more minutes of conversation, right? Okay. So Ferose typically has not talked about his own book that will release in 3 weeks.
Yeah.
And it's a collection of his essays that he's been writing for many years. So when you hear essays about books, I don't think you grasp what this man does with those. So I just want to read a couple of titles of this, right? Writing Around Wars. Right? So that's one of his columns titles. The Rise of Fascism. And then what was the title of the pet column? My Return to Poison. Yes. Math Matters. Right? And so what the word essay itself comes from around the 16th century from Montaigne, and it seems to he seems to have borrowed the word itself from experiment, essay, attempt. Right? So it's a reaching for something. So tell them what you do with essays.
Thank you. So the way I think, I've probably written 200 essays right now, and I can tell you that it's kind of become a muscle memory in the sense that I first look for a topic, and then I kind of deep dive for a month on that topic. So funnily enough, what I'm currently researching is on marriage, okay? So what I do is I study about marriage, like from the origins to the greatest books written about marriage. What are the numbers? What are the statistics? And I was like amazed to see the numbers. And it's just fascinating. Just to give you some context, 76% of the marriages in US don't work. 56 end up in divorce. 20% stay in marriages for the sake of the children. In India, that number is 1%. That's kind of how I open my essays, just to kind of give some context. Then I kind of go into like, what are the great books that are written about marriage? So I kind of try to tell a story which is insightful, but in the backdrop of some book recommendations, right? If you want to read about marriage, this is what it is. If you want to read about wars, these are the best books, and so on. So I've been doing that. And so the publisher reached out to me last year and said, Ferose, can we do an anthology, a collection of 100 of your essays? And they believe your essays should be timeless, so it's relevant even if you've written 7 years ago. So I said, that's called recycling. And I don't like to recycle stuff. I mean, it's already there. What's the big deal? So I said, why can't we do something called upcycling? They said, what's upcycling? I said, you know what? Can I take the same essay, add some more context to it, and increase in its value? And then I was thinking how to do that, and then I went to a nonprofit in India called Sense Kaleidoscope. So this was one of the schools where they teach autistic children art, and their art will blow your mind. They have done shows in Paris and all of that. So I said, you know what, let me give my essay to these autistic artists and ask them to draw it, because they think differently, so they will draw it differently. So I got a team of 5 autistic artists. They were all from the age of 20 to 40. And basically, you read an essay to them, and 5 of them will sit around and draw it. And then I pick the one that I think was the closest representation, and then include the art and the essay piece together. And so it's kind of art and literature coming together. So for the last 2 years, these autistic artists have been painting my essays, and now that has made it into a book. And that's what I say. It's shelf-aware, a love affair with books, with art by artists who are on the autism spectrum. So I've tried to bring art, literature, and a social mission to the book, where all the proceeds of the book go to support the artists.
There are some essays and poems that have been very influential and important to you. Can you tell us about those?
Yeah, I think there are two. I'll very quickly tell you 2 of my favorite essay and my favorite poem. My favorite essay is this is an incredible essay, and I hope everybody reads this. This is by a Nigerian writer. Her name is Chimamanda Adichie. You all know, how many of you have read her works? Fantastic. One of my favorite essays is actually a speech that she gave at Harvard in 2018. How many have heard of that? Fantastic. And this is actually a very special edition of that speech, which is made by hand. So this is a letterpress book. This is not a typical printed book. It's made by hand. So this is a very special piece. But there are 1 or 2 things in the book, in the essay, that I absolutely loved, and I kind of keep it with me all the time. One of the things she says is, have a good bullshit detector, okay? But always use on yourself first, right? I work in the corporate world. There's a lot of bullshit going around, so good leaders should have a good bullshit detector. And that essay is fascinating because she ends by saying, make literature your religion. Okay, so I loved that essay. If you get a chance, do read that essay. That's one of my favorite essays. I'll tell you, my favorite poem is obviously Tagore from his book Gitanjali. If you have not read Gitanjali, just read one poem, which is poem number 50. It's one of the most beautiful poems. I don't remember the poem, but I'll kind of summarize what the spirit of the poem is. The poem is all about a beggar basically going from home to home, begging for food, and then he sees the king coming towards him. When he sees the king coming towards him, he gets very happy. He said, wow, my day is going to be great because the king is going to give me a lot of food, whatever, right? And the king comes to the beggar and opens his palms. And the king is begging to the beggar. And the beggar is confused and angry. He's like, why is the king begging to me? And so he very reluctantly takes a grain of corn and gives it to the king. And the king goes away. So he had a lot of, grains of corns, but he just took one and gave it to the king. And at night, the beggar goes home and he kind of puts all the rice onto the floor to start cooking, and he sees one grain of gold grain. That grain that was there was made of gold. And that's when he says, I wish I had the heart to give it all. Right?
Okay, and we have 5 minutes left, and we'll do Q&A after that. But because you read more than most people that I know, can you give us 2-3 recommendations that you've read recently of books and that you've really liked?
So one of my favorite books is of late is Analog C Review. Have anybody read this book? This is a beautiful book. Please pick it up. Collection of essays and poems. Now I'll tell you why this is unique. This book is published in Germany, and the founder of the book he really believes in one thing, that in a digital world we need to have some part of our life to be analog. He says there's no getting away from the fact that we are all going to live in a digital world. But he says choose one aspect of your life that is going to be analog. And he says maybe you choose books to be analog. So his mission was to publish one book a year, but you wouldn't find this online. You will only get it in an independent bookstore. He has no email address. He has only a postal address on his website. So if you want this book, because it's not there in your nearest independent bookstore, you have to actually write him a letter. And when you write a letter, it'll reach after a month. You will get a book after a month. So he says, you know, you want the anticipation of reading a book. And this is one of my favorite books, and they publish only one book a year. He's a very dear friend, the CEO, he's based out of Germany, and his whole manifesto is basically about our right to disconnect.
One or two more?
Okay. I mean, as a book collector, I'll tell you the story behind. This is one of my favorite books. If you're into book collecting, this is a must-read. It's called Gently Mad by Nicholas A. Busbens. So Nicholas Busbens is considered one of the greatest book scholars in the world. And I got into book collecting thanks to this book. And I hadn't known him, but I read this book for many years, and I always kept a copy of this. I'll tell you two incredible stories from the book, so that you know why this book is so fascinating. There's a story about a book thief, okay? His name is Stephen Bloomberg. He's considered the greatest book thief in America. He stole 23,000 books worth $5 million. And he basically stole from every possible university in America. He stole from 45 different states and finally was caught. The funny thing was, he loved books, so he didn't sell them. He had all the books with him. And I think he went to jail for a few years, but he was a genuine book lover. But he stole from museums and universities, and it's funny that his collection is now called the Bloomberg Collection. And the second fascinating story is about what are the kind of books that survive. If you look, Alexandria was the greatest library, got destroyed. Iraq had a great library, got destroyed because America bombed down, all the libraries were finished. So one of the libraries that have survived is called the Walking Library from the 10th century. Now, what's a walking library? There was this amazing Wazir of Persia. He had 117,000 books. And he said, everywhere he goes, I will carry my books. So it's not a fixed library, it's a walking library. And at that time, he used to carry all the books on a camel. So he had 400 camels that carried the books. But the interesting thing was, all the camels had to walk in alphabetical order.
Okay, so I'm sure you have lots of questions that you want to ask Ferose. And so how are we going to do this? Logistics? Can people just stand up and ask questions?
Yeah, just shout.
Just shout.
It's easy. Yeah, I have a question here.
Sometimes an e-book or an audiobook is more accessible for people with disabilities,
Yeah.
right? So how do you, but I agree, like the physical book like has an aura about it. So how can we kind of recreate that magic of that physical book for someone for whom a digital book is more accessible or an audiobook?
Very good. I mean, I'm a big believer in making every book accessible. In fact, this book had a Braille edition. You know, if you do a Braille edition of this book, it comes to this size. Okay, so I believe that every book should be accessible. The way I see it is, people have to understand the difference between content and medium. The content is available for everybody, and the content can be audio, content can be digital, but the medium also matters. The physical book also matters, right? For example, I mean, I'll dread the time when the President of America has to take an oath of presidency on a Kindle, instead of a real Bible, right? I mean, so there is something about the physical part which is almost impossible to replicate in a digital part. The reason is nobody owns the digital book. So assuming you buy a book, you don't own it. It's owned by Amazon. One day they can change the version of that book. You won't even know. You can delete the book. So nobody owns a digital book. The only thing that you can own is a physical book. The digital book is always owned by the publisher. They can change it, they can delete it, they can edit it, you won't even know. You have no control over it. But this book exclusively belongs to me. So I think there is a merit in the medium being physical as well. But you're right, in many cases, There's no doubt that audiobooks, I still read a lot of audiobooks. My son, who's autistic, who's 14 years old, is non-verbal. He's an auditory learner. So the way we teach him is just play Harry Potter on the Audible, and he's literally memorized the whole book. So he's an auditory learner. He doesn't read this. So I appreciate and I understand there is a need for different forms of medium for a book to be accessible. Yes.
Ferose, as you well know, Vikram Geeks of Mind, the subtitle is Code of Beauty, Beauty of Code.
Yes.
Using that same cadence, how does your corporate life inform your writing life, and how does your writing life inform your corporate life?
Beautiful question. I get this question all the time. So people often ask me, what do you really do? Okay? Because I'm an executive at SAP. I teach leadership at Columbia University. I write columns and books. I run my non-profit in India called the India Inclusion Foundation, and I have a profoundly disabled child. My biggest role is that of a father. Everything else pales in comparison to the other things. So they say, what the hell do you really do? I say, I'm a storyteller. I tell stories in my corporate job to inspire people for a mission. I tell stories in my non-profit to inspire my volunteers to go for a bigger cause. I write to inspire. I think at the end of it, I'm just a storyteller. The rest is just different ways to achieve the end goal. So I think I'm a storyteller. And sometimes it's like having a 4-course meal, right? You don't have to have one thing. You can do many things. And I think this generation will have multiple careers in a single lifetime. You cannot be a software engineer for the rest of your life. You will have multiple careers in a single lifetime. Yes, ma'am.
Some of us are at the age that we're grandparents.
Yes.
What tips would you give a grandchild who enjoys writing to aspire and improve?
Beautiful question. Thank you for asking that. All I can tell you, get your kids away from a device. Okay, number one. And that can only happen if you get yourself off a device. Because if you have a device and you're telling your child, don't, that's not going to work. Get them off a device. Please make them read. The future generation is dependent on parenting, nothing else. And I've got people saying, why should anybody read? I'm like, there goes the whole world. If people don't read, it's the end of mankind. I can tell you, this is not a joke. Dr. Verghese told this beautifully by quoting Mark Twain. There is no difference between a person who cannot read and a person who does not read. Please get your children addicted to reading. The medium does not matter. They can read on a Kindle, they can read on a book, but please get them to reading. Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. Very good question. I'll give you a simple answer my friend Adam Grant said, and I'll give you this example. Adam Grant is actually speaking in the Bay Area on November 15th, hosted by Kepler's, kind of doing advertising for him. But he's a dear friend. He wrote a book called Give and Take, and he spent 10 years researching one simple question. In a corporate world, and I'm only using corporates right now, who's the most successful? Is it a giver, is it a taker, or is it a matcher? Who is a giver, taker, and a matcher? A giver is a person who gives more than he takes. A taker is a person who takes more than he gives. And a matcher is a person who gives as much as he takes. Very simple. So he spent 10 years researching companies and saying, who is the most successful person in a company? Is it a giver, taker, or a matcher? Please tell me, how many of you think it's a taker? Raise your hands. Okay, a few. There's nothing wrong with it. I'll tell you statistically what's the answer. How many of you think it's a matcher who's the most successful? Okay, some of you. How many of you think givers is the most successful? Most of you. Here is the answer. He said the bottom 20% in every organization is a giver. But here is the good news. He said the top 20% is also a giver. What he said was the taker is successful in a short run. So if he stays in a company for 1 year, the taker wins the game because it takes a year for people to recognize he's a taker. But after 1 year, everybody knows and they don't support him. The matcher is very important because if the giver and taker are equally eligible, the matchers always support the giver and they bump them up to become more successful. The problem is sometimes the givers are so naive that they do all the work for others and don't get the credit, so they end up at the bottom. But if you stay long enough and if you constantly give, you will eventually become the most successful person in the company. So Adam Grant said, giving is a good strategy. Be a giver, but for a very, very, very long period of time. Yes, sir. Okay, Maverick by Ricardo Semler. So I read Maverick when I became a kind of a new manager, and I was managing a team of around 35 people. And I read Maverick, and it was fascinating. He said two things which I still remember. In his company, he did the following. The employees did the performance appraisal of the boss, not the other way around. And the second thing was the employees decided their own hikes. They said, it's not decided by somebody else. We trust you. You tell me how much hike you deserve, and you will get it. And it became one of the most successful companies in the world. So goodness works. And I tried that in my team. It always worked. It always worked. And I was, for many years, voted the best manager, leader, blah, blah, blah. But I'm saying if you trust people, they will always repay you back. One question. Yes, ma'am.
I have two questions.
Yes.
First of all, are there any resources that you can point us to for autistic kids, severely autistic kids in India?
Yeah.
If so, please do. We have one at home.
Yeah.
And second question is, if you would be allowed to set a rule for everybody in the world,
Yeah.
what would that be?
Wow, that's giving me too much power. I would say make reading mandatory. Reading actually means not giving a homework, and reading as a group activity. You know, people have to stand up and read. I grew up doing that. I had to read from a passage and somebody else will critique it. You know, make reading a group activity for people to do. In terms of autism, it's there are many resources. Just meet me after the session. I've spent my whole life doing this work, so please let me know. I'll be happy to support you. My foundation is India Inclusion Foundation, so you can do a search for that. You'll find a lot of resources there. Yeah, thank you. How much is? How much? We have
6 minutes.
6 more minutes. Okay, I'll do it very quick. Yes.
I'm curious from your perspective, given how much you read.
Yeah.
Where do you lie in terms of your own reading on fiction versus non-fiction?
Very good question. I'll tell you two biases that I had. So last 2 years ago, I was looking at my bookshelf, which was, have literally around the room, and I found an unintended bias. 90% of the authors were male, and I didn't realize it. So I said, I'm going to spend the next 1 year reading only female authors. And I did kind of almost the whole year, but I read a few, I kind of cheated a little bit here and there. But reading, it's an unintended bias. I didn't realize it. And really, it opened up my world. I think you should only read female authors. Except mine, of course. No, just joking. But, so that was an interesting insight that I had found about myself. Good question. It's all, I would say 90% is nonfiction. And that's why I have such great admiration for Vikram, because I have no clue what great imagination you have to write a book like Sacred Games and so on. It's a different level of skill. I don't have that. And the longest fiction I wrote was, there was a competition for a 100-word fictional story. And that's when that's the first time I applied for that, and I wrote a 100-word story. Yes, ma'am.
I have a 12-year-old with autism, and I know how all-encompassing that can be as a parent.
Yeah.
I'm curious to know how you balance all of these interests while also parenting.
I'm not very good at it. I can tell you, and you should ask my wife, and she often calls me an absentee father. And I must confess that COVID was a blessing in disguise, because I didn't travel for like 3 years. And that's when I realized how much I missed being at home. So I've literally cut down on all my external engagements. I do very few of them because I want to be an equal partner. In fact, tomorrow I'm doing the full day care for my son, and my wife will be attending Sala. So we kind of divide and conquer. Yeah. Thank you.
I have a quick question. Any subcontinent South Asian Indian female
Good question. Let me say, have you read Nisha Susan? She wrote a book called, I'm forgetting the title, but she had something about how we did not invent Facebook and other books. Amazing. She's amazing. For people in India, there was this pink chaddi campaign. आपको याद है? Does anybody know? Basically, there was this BJP guy who said something against women, Valentine's Day, and then she started a campaign to send pink panties to his house. I mean, that became viral, and the post guys were like, it was started by Nisha Susan. And she's currently moved to Canada, and I spoke to her last week. Incredible writer. Absolutely fantastic sense of humor. Great admiration for her. So she's somebody I would highly recommend, Nisha Susan. One last question. Yes, ma'am. Yeah. I agree. I agree. No time. I agree. We all are guilty of putting our children through so much of pressure and stress that they don't have time for all the fun things, including reading. My core belief is the only thing that works is role modeling. Yeah, if you have teenage children, if you tell them to read, they will never read. But if you surround yourself with books and you and your spouse are reading often, read together. Make reading a family activity. Just like you have family dinners, read and discuss a book around the table. I mean, that's so much fun. And I'm saying you can stop reading for some time and pick it up again. I didn't read enough books for like 10 years of my life. But when I started it again, I never stopped after that. That's okay. As long as you have the muscle memory to want to read, you can take a break once in a while, and that's absolutely fine. Yeah. Yeah. I agree. I mean, I'm dying, me and my wife, trying to do the homework for my son. Remember, my son is autistic non-verbal. So we are his communication partner. So what typically will take a neurotypical person 1 hour, it takes us 4 hours. And we have to sit in his class. So basically, me and my wife are currently in 9th grade, because we have to sit in all his classes because he communicates through us. It's incredibly hard. And most of the times when they ask us to do 10 problems, we do 3. I said, as long as you got the concept, why should I repeat the same thing over and over again? It just takes too much time. I know it's hard. Thank you. I think we are running out of time. Thank you for listening to me, even though you wanted to hear Vikram.
Thank you so much for being here, and let's give Ferose a big round of applause.